Ja, goedemiddag, hartelijk welkom. Weer bij een sessie van de BPUG, weer een leuk webinar vandaag. Vandaag hebben we een webinar met een Engelse titel, met Engelse Duitse gasten. De titel is It's the Stupid People, Oops, the People Stupid. En aan de andere kant van de oceaan en achter ons hebben wij Richard Pharro en Stephan Brendel van APMG, die ons vandaag meenemen in een leuk verhaal. Ja, voor mij een leuk verhaal waar we zo meteen verder over ingaan. Namens de BPUG van harte welkom bij deze sessie. Nou, voor de mensen die ons niet kennen, de BPUG, de Best Practice User Group Nederland, richt zich op mensen zoals jullie die in projecten, programma's, portfolio management en change management actief zijn. En samen willen we graag leren van ja, hoe we projecten doen, wat kan beter, wat gaat goed, nou, noem het maar op. En nou ja, door de corona, normaal gesproken hebben wij maandelijks sessies. Helaas, deze sessies zijn nu niet meer maandelijks fysiek. Maar we proberen iedere maand 1 of 2 van deze sessies te doen. Om toch de verbinding met elkaar te hebben. En leuke dingen te doen en te leren. En dat is voor mij het leukste wat er is. En uiteindelijk hebben we ook een seminar wat we jaarlijks hebben. Het jaarlijkse seminar thema is Time to Change. En daarvan is ook, ja, weet je, die hebben we door moeten schuiven naar 1 juni 2021. Ook dit weer door corona en hopelijk gaan we de goede kant op, zodat we dit ook 1 juni 2021 kunnen doen. En Time to Change, ja, dat is wel ja, wat we de hele periode al meemaken. We moeten veranderen, we moeten digitaal samenwerken, we moeten onze webinars omzetten. Dit is continu iets waar organisaties en wij als mensen mee moeten dealen, veranderingen. Nou, onze volgende sessie, our next session, is 17 september. En dat is met Joyce Omen, Hannelore Albrecht en Paul Mutsaas. Dat gaat over het klantproces in beeld brengen. De afgelopen periode hebben we verschillende tools gebruikt om digitaal samen te werken. En wat je daarmee ziet is, ja, we willen graag technieken toepassen, kennis uitwisselen. En deze sessie 17 september, die gaat vooral over een tooling, het visualiseren. Dus daar gaan we een tool gebruiken om te tekenen en om samen te werken. Dus dat is weer een leuke, want die hebben we nog niet eerder gehad. We hebben Teams al een keer gehad, we hebben Zoom gehad. De outbreak sessies of breakout sessies, allerlei sessies. En deze gaat meer over de volgende tool, hoe ga je visualiseren. En hoe je daarmee het klantproces mee in beeld brengt. Huishoudelijk. Dingetje wat belangrijk is, deze sessie wordt opgenomen. En dus hij komt beschikbaar, dus je kunt hem nakijken. Na de sessie krijg je die link al, die kun je al gebruiken. En vervolgens vragen wij aan het eind ook even de sessie te evalueren. Wat ging goed, wat kon beter. En uiteraard ook, het is een Engelse sessie, hoe bevalt dat? En wellicht hebben jullie een idee voor een volgend webinar. Ja, hoe gaan we dat doen? Hoe gaan we daarvoor zorgen? En weet je, de presentatie en de recordings komen na deze sessie. Gedurende de presentatie van Richard en Stephan kun je vragen stellen. Als je in de balk onderin van Teams kijkt, dan heb je daar een icoontje met 2 wolkjes en een vraag. En die kun je aanklikken en dan komt er aan de rechterkant een scherm. En daarmee kun je vragen stellen. Dus we doen zometeen een poll. En we vragen aan een aantal dingetjes. Heb je gedurende het gesprek tussen Richard en Stephan een vraag stellen? Dan schrijf ik hem op en probeer ik hem gedurende het gesprek erin te schieten. Zodat die beantwoord kan worden. Nou, dat is volgens mij wat ik je mee wil geven in het Nederlands. In de inhoudelijkheid. Then I'll turn in English. And I would like to welcome Stephan Brendel and Richard Pharro. Let's say they were so kind to do a session with us. I know them for many years, many years. And let's say the first introduction was with Richard, the CEO of APMG International. And he did a presentation many years ago with the BPUG, and he matched himself with a chimpanzee. And I must admit that is something which always stuck in kept in my head about. If you do an introduction and you have fun, then people remember, and that was a lesson learned. And Stephan joined a couple of years later with APMG, and we worked closely together with APMG Benelux in the Netherlands about Prince to Agile and all these frameworks they put in the market. And these guys will guide us through this session. Stephan lives in Germany and the Netherlands, and Richard is in the UK. So let's say we're having an international set today. And basically that's what I would like to say. And I would like to welcome Richard and Stephan to take over. And then, of course, the technique will kick in.
Dankjewel, goed. Dankjewel.
You're welcome.
For this wonderful introduction.
Yeah.
Yes, I actually wanted to straight go into our session. So on the agenda, we just keep a couple of minutes about who is APMG, because not everybody might know us yet, although we're here for a long time. Richard and I made a lot of research, and you always have to do this after some time, about failed projects that we call, that can be named as challenged project, and also successful projects, and then try to also iterate the learning points. Now, there's one thing important: the title of the presentation does not anticipate the answers. It's more complicated than that, I suppose. So if we want to start, then first we start with you guys, with a question to the audience. Now, what do you think, how many projects have failed 25 years ago? I mean, there are statistics today, but how did the statistics look like 25 years ago? Goed, would you mind helping us how people can add?
Yeah. For the people listening, if you look at the toolbar underneath the presentation, there is the two clouds with the question mark. If you click on it, of als je daarop klikt, ik kan het in het Nederlands doen, hè, dan komt vragen en antwoorden rechts in beeld. En kun je daar je inschatting doen. Doe die in percentages, dan probeer ik zo snel mogelijk uit te rekenen wat jullie inschatting is. Dus de vraag is heel simpel: hoeveel van de projecten mislukten 25 jaar geleden? Als jullie daar een antwoord op willen geven, dus zoek even in het balkje als je over de presentatie, het filmpje heen gaat, naar de twee wolkjes met het vraagteken. About the same as today, that's the first. Een percentage probeerde ik mee te geven.
Why don't we give people time to complete that, and Richard just tell us about APMG.
Yeah, sounds good.
Ruud, thank you very much for the introduction. I'm pleased to remember the chimpanzee, but you often forget me, so I'm pleased that was at least memorable. Just a little bit about APMG. I'm sure a lot of people do know, but we started in 1995, and our business is around professional qualifications and best practice and certification. We started with Prince 2, which we built to be a global project management methodology, and through the early 20s up to about 2009, we opened offices around the world, and we had then translated Prince 2 into about 21 languages. We had 400 training companies working with us and over 1,000 trainers, and we added more products to the portfolio. We did a pivot a few years ago where we have a more diverse portfolio than we used to have, much more work in cybersecurity, much more things in terms of data transformation, change management, big data, user experience, and what have you. And we've seen a major move over that period for more people moving to deliver training online. Clearly COVID-19 has accelerated that. We hope to see classrooms returning because we believe it is all about people, and we would like to see that personal engagement coming back in. But this isn't about APMG, and this isn't about project management. The exciting thing about this presentation, when Ruud asked us to do it, is we're talking about projects, and projects are exciting. Indeed, you could say projects are sexy. We work with a lot of organizations on a whole range of best practices. And this is a selection. And as you can see, we're into agile, we do cybersecurity, business relationship management, some IT governance with ISACA. And in the Netherlands, we're working with OBM Dynamics on the human factors that help organizations improve. If we could just move on from that, Stephan.
Yeah, I mean, when we start with fair projects, Ruud, I wonder if you have a couple of results for us from the survey we started, people. I think, Ruud, you're on mute.
Let's say the results are between 25% and 75%. So if I do a quick guesstimate, it's around 55–60% if the average the people send in.
Richard, what does that tell us? It's like it used to be better than today, right? Recent studies are rather talking about 80% fair project, mainly in IT. Or am I missing something, Richard? I think that's what we found.
No,
right?
I think the survey suggests about 80% of IT projects failed 25 years ago, and about 80% of IT projects fail today. I think generally projects haven't really changed as well. I think it was about 50–60% of projects failed about 25 years ago, and still, depending on what surveys you look at, between 40 and 60% of projects fail today. So in the last 25 years, the profession of project management and project managers have not moved the dial in delivering more successful projects.
Yeah.
And that's what we're going to talk about. So off you go, Stephan.
Yeah, what I want to do is I want to give a couple of examples, and you might know some of those, and some you might not know, or might not even know the story behind this. Let me kick off with the one in the upper left-hand corner, the Sony Betamax. Some of us older guys might know about this. I mean, there have always been wars about formats, but this has been called the masterpiece if you research on it. Very typically, and we found this before and afterwards, we found this, that it was a very costly license model behind it, probably the better technology, but we know all the end of that story was that JVC with the VHS video format actually made the race, and Sony, I think, retired the Betamax a couple of years, a decade ago. You can still buy devices, by the way, you can still even buy tapes, but that's about it. It's a lost race. It's a failed project. The main reason really is the license model and too expensive. So something that had to have a return on invest within a very short time. Another example is the Challenger space shuttle. Now, you might wonder, why do we consider this being a fair project? Now it is because the idea, the initial vision was to make space travel a commodity, and that greatly failed for several reasons. I mean, one was we had these two disasters with the Challenger, and later on it was the Columbia. There were so many technical issues. It was very expensive. There was no sustainability. As we know today, there's some private companies like SpaceX who actually are advancing that and bringing that vision more to life about making space travel commodity. We're not there yet, but we might see that. If you then look at this car, I don't know if you ever heard about the Ford Edsel. You didn't. So in the 50s, in the mid-50s, Americans in particular were buying cars like crazy, and usually just kept a car for 2 years. So if it is, for example, General Motors had a Chevrolet, and then you went into an Oldsmobile, and then into Cadillac, just to show where you are, who you are, it's your status. Ford was missing that. So Ford was trying to build a car which actually could address that middle class. And the reason why the Ford Edsel really never kicked off the ground was because of the design. There have been a lot of associations around this kind of design. I don't want to mention them, but research them and you will find it. So terrible design. They had completely unwanted changes of interiors, like the speedometer, where you actually had to have an engineering degree to understand how that speedometer actually works. Something users have never been asked for. Yeah, In the end, Ford lost $300 million on that. And in 1957, $300 million was quite a lot of money. Another project, which is going to end as of and is considered to be a failed project, is the A380. Production is going to be stopped in, I think, springtime next year. And the reason for that is that when this was designed, Airbus had much more political influence, I think, or was influenced by politics from the different countries. And the design was, there was the idea, okay, we have hubs, and airlines will expand their hubs to transport a lot of people from one place to the other to then have smaller planes flying to the other areas. Now, Boeing had a different idea, which actually was also adopted by Airbus, to have smaller planes with better technology for point-to-point connections, which is what's happening today. Even the 747 is about to be retired. So there was not enough thought to the end. Will that plane that can transport up to 800 people, actually will that be a business case in the long term? Because they really have to have these planes full to be profitable. I don't know if anybody heard about the Apple Lisa. Now, there are people celebrating about Steve Jobs. He actually had two big mistakes, big fails in his career. One was the Next computer. I'm not talking about this one, but he founded Next because he was fired by Apple because of the Apple Lisa, which was actually the first computer with the mouse, and the computer mouse was a very rare animal at that time in 1983. It had a graphical interface, was just monochrome. Nobody had that, but it was just too expensive. It was targeted for business people. It cost about $10,000 at that time, would be about 30,000 euros today. So they couldn't really sell any of those clearly, and they had to bury them. They actually buried them on a graveyard in Utah. I don't know if that's a tale, but that's something I found out. So it was just too expensive. And then there is the Millennium Dome. Now, Richard, this London is your hometown. Actually, have you ever been to the Millennium Dome?
I have been to the Millennium Dome as it now is. So it's now the London Arena or the O2 Arena. So it didn't succeed for the Millennium. It was forecast, I think, to have 12 million people in the first year, and it only had 6.5 million. I think it then cost the UK government about £1 million a month to run, so they gave it away. But the big problem with it is they built the dome, but they forgot about the transport links to get people there.
Yeah.
So if you got there, it was okay.
There was also a bit of looking at this great exhibition in 1851 in London, which was still a time of the empire. What we found, there was almost £800 million investment, but they only could recoup £190 million. So the big exhibition. So there was no view or no vision on what actually happens after the millennium, because that's what it was built for.
Yeah.
So what we found then, and these top factors of failed projects are not just for those 6 examples I just gave you. It's what we found in general. And some of those might not even be a surprise, because they have been around for a long time. And the question rather is, why haven't they been fixed yet? Incomplete requirements, a lack of user involvement. Ford Edsel, great example for that. A lack of resource, a lack of executive support, where people really standing behind those kind of projects, a lack of planning Airbus, lack of IT management, very unrealistic expectations. That requirements tend to change, and so do specifications. Some things just haven't been needed any longer. The A380 over time won't be needed any longer. And then there is the technical illiteracy, so the inability to apply knowledge derived from technology. So that what we found were the top factors, but we also know about projects that we would consider to be challenge projects, right, Richard?
Yeah, I mean, challenge projects is an interesting term. We didn't invent it. It is something that other people have used. So these are projects that probably failed in terms of their original output, but maybe the outcome is good. So we pulled together a selection of challenge projects just to put some sort of structure behind that. I mean, everybody hopefully will recognise Sydney Opera House. It's probably one of the most iconic buildings in the world. But if you look at the research, I mean, it started in 1954 when the government of New South Wales in Australia actually wanted to build a new concert hall. But they wouldn't call it a concert hall because there already was a concert hall. So they called it an opera house. They had an international competition and the design was won by a Danish architect who had never built an opera house, had never built a concert hall. And his design had no input from any engineers, no acoustic engineers, no structural engineers. And all the judges who appointed him were all architects. So it was architects voting for architects with no real understanding of how to build it. So the whole construction of it took, as it says there, it took sort of 14 years rather than 4 years. There was a change of local government, the architect was sacked, a new group of architects came in to try to deliver it. There's a story the architect didn't even have a telephone in his studio and he wouldn't talk to the engineers. The engineers were not involved in the design and the construction. And if you look into it, it's all to do with the wrong people being appointed, the lack of client engagement in terms of the appointment, a change of government, change of contractor, and all of those things that just came together to make it, in terms of the original project, a disaster. But in terms of the outcome, one of the most iconic buildings in the world, everybody recognise it. So is it a failure or is it a success? And I think, as they would say, the jury is out on that. But lack of scope, clarification, no accountability, unclear responsibility, those were the main factors, a certain naivety, I suppose, in the appointment that meant Sydney Opera House wasn't a successful project in terms of output, but maybe in the long term in terms of outcome. Could you move on, Stephan? Now, this is one that Stephan knows very well because, Berlin Brandenburg Airport, it says opening 2020. I think we've really got to wait and see whether that's the case. Once again, driven by politicians. And I think the politicians on the supervisory board, again, they appointed an architect to design an airport, and the architect did not like shopping. So he didn't want people to go shopping and drag their goods around his airport. Now, 50% of the revenue for an airport usually comes from shopping. So halfway through the project, they had to build another floor to accommodate the shopping. The financial crisis came along in 2007, 2008, which meant that there was no major contractor willing to take on the project. So the supervisory board, all of whom were German politicians, decided to appoint 30 to 40 small contractors to do the work because they thought they would get a low price. They had a very German style management system that was so complex that nobody knew how it worked and nobody could work in accordance with it. If you remember, at that time, low-cost airlines were coming into being. And this airport, because it was a national symbol, had expensive air bridges for the big Airbus, and they couldn't accommodate the low-cost airlines. So they had to then try to change halfway through to build in simpler solutions for the low-cost airlines. Because the management system was so complex, they didn't know what they had to change. And I think the The real issue for me was when Angela Merkel came along to open it, the person that was supposed to sign it off for security and safety on behalf of, no doubt, the local Berlin government, refused to sign it off because it was an unsafe building. The sophisticated control processes simply didn't work. So they couldn't open it. They then appointed a new construction manager, and he asked somebody to do a survey. 550,000 faults were found in the airport, ranging from, according to the research, the wrong light bulbs to, quote, all the cabling is wrong, unquote. And then someone said, we've already spent too much money, we ought to finish it. So who knows when it will be built? Who knows? Stephan, I don't know if you have any inside information.
It's going to open in October, because one thing what they now have and never had before is they have the operating license. And because, I mean, Berlin is my hometown, so I have to protect them a little bit. In 1936, they opened the largest airport in the world after 6 years, with still one of the largest buildings in the world, right after the Boeing manufacturing. So it's not that they can't build, but on this one, I agree, you couldn't fail more, I think, this one.
Excellent. So if we move on, it's not just the Germans that get it wrong. It's also the French. Oh, and the British, because it was...
And the Dutch. And the Dutch.
And the Dutch. Well, no, well, the Dutch maybe. So again, people will recognise Concorde. Yeah, probably one of the most iconic aeroplanes that flew. A phenomenal technical success, but an absolute commercial failure. So when Concorde was conceived in about 1960, 1962, the market analysis said that they would sell 350 airplanes by 1980. The reality is they only built 20 and only 13 or 14 flew. And the only two airlines that bought Concorde was British Airways and Air France, because it was built through a joint venture between Sud Aviation in France and I can't remember who the company was in the UK, but it was certainly a joint venture. It was a joint venture because at the time the UK government tried to join the EEC, the European Economic Union. And they thought that by involving the French rather than the Americans, then that would get support from de Gaulle to help the UK government join Europe. That did not work. So they built the aeroplane. It went well over budget. It was hit by the oil crisis. At the time when it was coming into production, into use, as Stephan said, the 747 was flying. The 747 was a third of the price per passenger mile than Concorde. Environmentalists didn't like the sonic boom. The Americans wouldn't let it land because they weren't involved in the construction, and so on and so forth. Great technical success, terrible commercial failure. But again, in terms of an iconic image, in terms of a statement of technical capability of both the French and the British, was it successful? Everybody recognises Concorde. So has it actually generated a return because of that for British Airways and in France in terms of marketing and promotion of the technical prowess of both countries? Again, it's a very difficult one, except clearly Concorde has now been grounded following a disastrous crash a few years ago, unlike the Sydney Opera House that continues to stand there. So again, another interesting project, and you'd have your views. Dutch total football. Stephan and I cannot have a presentation in the Netherlands without touching on the Dutch total football, which again, I think has been around a while. According to my research, total football first started about 1930, 1940. But the whole concept of total football is to use the space on the football pitch and for every player to be able to either attack, defend, play midfield, and generally move around the pitch. The major proponent of it recently was, I think, it was Johan Cruyff. I think he paid for, I'm not sure which Dutch, did he play for Ajax, Cruyff?
Yeah.
Do you know?
I think he did. He did.
I think, and they were all conquering in the Dutch league. So in the time that that Cruyff was playing and the team were playing, they were able to command the game. They won every trophy going. They then came into the World Cup with that model, and they were probably one of the most entertaining teams in the World Cup. But they lost the final, and they lost the final because the opposition, who we shouldn't really mention because it happened to be Germany, but the opposition worked out at half time in the game how to beat them. And there was one of the German players, Bertie Volks, was able to stifle one player to enable the Germans to take control of the midfield. So for me, it's an example of something that could be really, really positive, very powerful. But unless every member of the team understands it and every member of the team is as good as that top person on the team, then success isn't always guaranteed. It has a lasting legacy in that most successful football teams in Europe now play that way. But they were unable to conquer the world with something that they perfected and developed. Again, it's a great legacy, but it wasn't successful at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And then coming right up to date, the Boeing 737 MAX. And again, terrible disasters with the recent crashes that we had of the Boeing 737 MAX, terrible loss of life. But the literature suggests it was a failure of leadership within Boeing, that they were caught flat-footed when Airbus launched a very fuel-friendly version of the 320 Airbus. I think it was the 320 new engine option. And they created the 737 MAX in about 8 or 9 months. And their fear was the 737 was the cash cow for Boeing. So Boeing had more sales of the 737 than any other aeroplane. And if they couldn't compete with a fuel efficient aeroplane, then they would lose sales to Airbus. Clearly, American Airlines would have still bought, and in fact, it was American Airlines that put the pressure on Boeing to actually create and launch the 737. In order to do it, they had to adjust the location of the engines to make them more fuel efficient, and also to move the front landing gear about 20 centimeters forward to give it the balance. But in order then to control the flight of the airplane, they then had to create a new flight management system, which I think was called MCAS, about moverability characteristics automation. And if you read the literature, the FAA did not have the competence to assess the software. So the regulator couldn't actually assess how successful it was. The arrogance within Boeing was that there was no need to retrain pilots. The initial training was a 2.5-hour training session on an iPad. And their people thought, clearly people could fly with it. The basic concept and the concern people had was a failure of leadership within the business, and they avoided or they ignored their core values, which were all about safety first and integrity. And it was because they were driven by the commercial need to bring an aeroplane into service to compete with Airbus. And it had disastrous consequences, both for the huge loss of life that's occurred and also the work that was is necessary to try to get it back into flight. I noticed today in the news, I think there's now the first trials of the 737 MAX in Europe, either yesterday or today. So time will tell whether it turns out to be a success, whether people will be willing to fly on it. But at the moment, I think it's probably more of a failure than a success. but it's a huge lesson in the need for integrity and leadership within the sponsor and the client's organisation. And it's not just about the engineering of the product, whatever that product may be. So when you start to look at these things, there's a common theme that seems to flow through them. Either a lack of initial research or an unwillingness to go back and check that research to make sure that it is still valid. Incomplete requirements and specifications. You know, some of these things clearly were not thought out at the right time and clearly didn't have the right people involved to make sure that they were complete. Variations and changes throughout. And one thing that does seem to be quite common is changing people at the top where there's not where there is inconsistent executive support. And if, like in Sydney Opera House, if the authority changes, then you have to change the architect and you have a bigger problem. And people not really understanding the complexity of what they're doing, which I think is to do with that lack of leadership, that lack of integrity, that lack of client or sponsoring knowledge about what it is they're undertaking.
Well, but there also have been, or still are, some successful projects out of these 20% and they're left. And we want to share a couple of those with you and tell you why they have been successful. But I think you can see the pattern now on our research when we ask the why. Richard, I want to kick off with the London Crystal Palace, and as you are a London hometowner, you might tell us about it.
I certainly will. If you're interested in projects and successful projects, I have to recommend that you look this one up. This is just a fantastically successful project. It was built for the Great Exhibition of 1851. As Stephan said, it was when Britain had an empire, and it was to showcase all the engineering might and what have you. But the process started in January 1850, and people were asked to submit their proposals, and they came in March 1850. 245 submissions were submitted within 3 weeks of asking people to submit, and they were all rejected by the commissioners responsible for building and running the Crystal Palace. A few weeks later, a gardener called Joseph Paxton, who built the greenhouse at one of the great houses in Britain called Chatsworth House, met one of the commissioners, someone called Henry Cole, and he submitted a design within 3 weeks based on a greenhouse that he had built. Now, it was a big greenhouse. It wasn't a greenhouse of 2 meters by 2 meters. It was a substantial greenhouse. So he submitted and had his design accepted on the 1st of July 1850. And then there was 8 months in which to build this project. So the cost that he put in was about a third of the best design that had been submitted that was rejected. And the area of ground that it covered was 25 times what that best design was. So he totally revolutionized people's thinking in terms of what could be built for a price and how much area it could cover. It was 7.2 acres was the area of the greenhouse of the Crystal Palace that was built. What he did, I think, was very, very innovative in that he used standard cast iron columns on a grid pattern and the largest size plate glass that was manufactured at the time. So everything was built basically from a kit of parts on a very regular pattern, using known technology, using known shapes. Now, they had 5,000 labourers on the site over the 8 months to build it. They erected 1,000 columns, and the total size of it is about 560 metres by about 140 metres. Halfway through, they had to change the project, which was the second story, and they still delivered it within 8 months, within budget, and it was opened on the 1st of May by Queen Victoria. Now, I think the fundamental success to this is just a short and clear line of command. Prince Albert, the Queen's Consort, was supporting it. Henry Cole, chairman, I think, of the commissioners, was supporting it. Paxton had the authority to design it, and the contractors that appointed, Fox and Henderson, also had the capability to build what was built. So it really is a masterpiece in building a complex from the outside building using known technology. And if you just think back to 1850, to get a proposal or to get a tender, you'd have to send it out by horse and carriage. You know, the technology there, just think about the logistics of getting everything to that place, and it was still done in 8 months. It's my favorite project in terms of the way it was managed and delivered.
This one is one of my favorites, and it was opened in 2012 by Queen Beatrix at that time of the Netherlands, 1 year ahead of planned finishing and completely in budget. The city of Rotterdam, or the port of Rotterdam, started 2004 to expand the capacity because they needed it. And what I always like about the Netherlands, that they try to steal land from the sea. Very successful in doing this here. What's remarkable about this one is it had a very, very strict project governance. Fortunately, at the time when this was running, some of APMG partners have been involved in this. So we know a little bit of insights about, because Prince2 has been used, MSP has been used as a method, some stakeholder management principles, change management. And I personally have spoken to managers of the Port of Rotterdam at that time. Two things that I found were probably most remarkable for that was, next to the project governance, they knew how to very smartly keep the political influence in distance by making a very smart change management process that, and Jens said, what comes from politician goes into trash. If it's a serious one, it goes the other side. I mean, just imagine that this, and they didn't want to be quoted on that one. So I'm not mentioning any names, but they said that was, and that was because I always looked at Berlin Airport and the Port of Rotterdam in comparison, because they all started at the same time, has similar political importance, and you could see how the Dutch did it and the Germans failed, or the Berlin government failed. So for me, this is one of my favorite projects, and it's a Dutch one.
Yeah, with the BPUG we visited the site with an annual event, and it was impressive how big this area is.
Yes, you can't really see it only from air.
Yeah.
I mean, if we're talking about political, then I can't think of a more political global project than Apollo. I think everyone knows that famous statement by President Kennedy in 1961. Yeah, America will put a man on the moon and bring him back to Earth within this decade. And if you look at Apollo, though, again, it had a lot of politics to start with. There are a lot of competing factors. But the things that stick in my mind for it is that they set up a completely new organization in order to build and deliver the Apollo shot. They brought in experienced people. So the people they brought in to run the various parts of the Apollo moonshot either came from Von Braun's V2 rocket people who had been working on the Minuteman rocket, or they came out of the US defense market or the US military Air Force that have been managing procurement of a big scale. And they fully equipped and staffed up the program with very, very experienced people who had a track record and knew what they were doing. Now, clearly they didn't have a track record in building a spacecraft and putting it on the moon and bringing the person back. And there was lots of competing arguments about what was the right solution. And interestingly, the right solution wasn't agreed to by a lot of the engineers, and it was the power of the leadership that actually agreed and forced through that solution. And that was the solution that had basically a lifeboat on it. And the reason that other engineers said you didn't need it is there was no way there could be a catastrophic failure. And of course, Apollo 11 failed. And it was the black swan event. It was the event that nobody ever thought would happen, that would prevent the Apollo rockets, spaceship returning to Earth. But because they had selected that technical solution, then the people were able to get into it and come back to Earth safely. But it was driven by Kennedy's vision to put a man on the moon, and it was also driven by America's desire to stay ahead of Russia in the space race and the technology. But if you look at it, the organizations were staffed with really experienced, capable people who knew what they were doing, unlike many of the other projects we discussed this afternoon.
No, this one is really not just another praise on Apple, but in fact, when you look at some of the backgrounds of the iPhone, which is today, I think there were more than 1.7 billion devices being sold, and it's been considered as the most commercial successful project or product in the 21st century up to now. There will others follow, but this one really is at the time. But interestingly, when they started this, everybody thought Apple would just build another phone, like there was Nokia and BlackBerry around at that time. And so the project was very low profile. It wasn't full blown, just small teams, but like on the Apollo, very talented people, very engaged people, a lot of security. And when they started the project, they did not know what would be the outcome. So maybe it was something we would today call agile. At that time, they probably didn't call it agile, right? But the iteration and the management support of Steve Jobs, 40% of his time was spent on that secret project. But that alone, the device was not the success. The success was building a closed ecosystem with an app store and with Apple's Apple stores, where they actually made the end user marketing. And the apps from the iPhone actually brought in the mobile internet as we know it today. I heard the statistics yesterday on a conference about that we have like 4.5 billion smartphone devices in the world, but only 1.4 billion toothbrushes. So the smartphone seems to be really important for people. Here with the iPhone, there was full management support, very engaged people, and as we all know, it had sent Nokia and BlackBerry into retirement.
I think we ought to move on relatively quickly. I'm very conscious of the time. So this is coming back to London, the London Olympics, which everyone hailed as a great success, one of the most successful Olympics of all time, and very profitable for the city. But if you look at it, there's a couple of interesting points for me. The original price for the London Olympics was £2.3 billion. The final price was £9.3 billion. And within that 9.3, when they started, they had 2.25 billion contingency. Now, I don't know how many people on this call managed to have something like a 25 to 30% contingency on the budget before they started. The things they got really well, coming back again, they had good level of political support. They set up its own operating company. They seconded very high quality, very high skilled people to it. The lessons learned suggest that you have to spend on getting the upfront planning right. You have to spend on putting the right people, the right competencies in there, and you have to spend on testing and making sure you are ready to go. the London Olympics tried to limit innovation, so they didn't want it to be a showcase of how wonderful things could be. They wanted to stick to proven, tested technology and solutions, and they completed the construction about a year before the games opened. But I don't know if everyone can remember, there was the fiasco though just before the games opened that they weren't able to recruit the right number of security personnel. And so something as obvious as that was overlooked, not enough time and attention was put to it. It was supposed to build a lasting legacy for London. I'm not sure that is the case. The main stadium was sold at a knockdown price to a London football club. It took a lot of money to convert it to a football stadium. So again, it's hailed as a successful project for the output. I think I'm still dubious about the outturn in terms of the outcome, in terms of the overall success and impact it will have on London. But there's a very, very good report done which runs about 30 or 40 pages on the lessons learned on the Olympics and what local government or government should do for successful projects in the future.
Well, let's quickly go through the top 5 factors, Richard.
Yeah, and I think as we covered off, it's user input, client input is quite important. Make sure there's consistent executive support. What is it you're going to do? Clear statements of requirements. None of this is rocket science, but as we've seen over the last half an hour, so many people get it wrong. Proper planning, realistic expectations, and a couple of things that really seem to make a difference, driven by a vision and with an end date that you cannot change. So everything that has succeeded has had that very, very clear end date. And that seems to be quite a big imperative to make sure projects do succeed.
If we go back into history a bit, then some people would say the Romans could have done it all better anyway, right? And because they also had a vision, there always was peace and prosperity within the Roman Empire. I just saw the quote from this famous Monty Python video, Life of Brian, which said, what did the Romans actually ever did for us, right? So where's the vision here? And no, they did nothing besides sanitary installations, medicine, education, literature, and so on and so on and so on. And as we can see here, not just water transport, but also water heating at that time. And I found out that a lot of these things actually have been laying down there and had been picked up in the late 19th century to be improved, and not before that, right? But I think, Richard, there are a couple of questions that we have to derive from everything we shared at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose these sorts of things, if you think about it, have we lost the human connection? Or human capabilities, failed projects, they didn't really know, they didn't have the competence of what they were doing. The steering groups, it was things beyond their capability. Successful projects seemed to bring in the right people and they had team strength. Let's make sure we have the right competencies, the right capabilities, and that we can deliver that. Failed projects had very, very complex processes and procedures, or they had them and they were not followed. The successful projects tend to reuse what they knew worked somewhere else, or very tight processes and procedures. So, making something complex clearly causes problems and failures. Keeping it simple gives people the opportunity and the environment in which they can succeed. And again, no clear vision, no clear thought about what it was people were trying to deliver, projects that failed, or they wouldn't change it when things were going wrong. They continued on regardless. And those that succeeded, a very clear vision, very clear objective, and I do believe a pretty unchangeable deadline also focuses the mind to enable people to really deliver the project as expected.
Okay.
No, we should.
Just a comment from me. We had another session with the BPUG, with Michiel van der Molen, and he said, put it on a coaster. Let's say, making sure that the project has a clear vision, really matches. All people understand what's being delivered. I think that really matches these points you mentioned, that it's important that the whole team understands this vision and we're heading to, and that should be as simple as possible. That's a nice one. With another session we have available, people can watch it, about put it on a coaster.
Yeah. Another question to the audience. Now, from all we shared with you, what are the 2 learning points that you have taken away? And please use the chat again and provide an answer by just writing down a couple of words or phrases or whatever. What have you taken away? We also have some learning points that Richard and I found after our research, but we give you some time to do that. I just want to share a metaphor that popped through my mind when I was looking at what failed, what was challenged, and so on. And so it is a little bit about, with us humans, like when you compare a roundabout with a crossing with traffic lights, then the main thing about the traffic light crossing is you really don't have to think. You just follow the colors, right? If you do, you might not fail. Yeah, there's just some simple, strict rules. There's nothing you have to think about, and that brings you safely over the crossing. The problem is that sometimes when there's no traffic, these traffic lights can really be a pain, right? And there are other areas where you think, I would like to have much more flexibility. Now, a roundabout, which I even think is a British invention, I thought so, but probably it came from China or somewhere else, like the football. But the roundabout is something that gives more flexibility. So it's actually just based on agreed principles. You have to think, yes, but you can manage, and in fact, roundabouts have proven to be much more secure. So they have 90% less fatalities when there is the rare occasion of an accident, and they have about 30% less collisions than traffic light crossings. Now, there's one exception, and I found this in the UK. Sorry, I have to give you that, Richard. In Cambridge, they opened up just recently the first so-called Dutch-style roundabout, giving yield to bicycle drivers. I mean, I'm quite a lot in the Netherlands. I know about bicycle drivers.
Yeah.
But in the UK they didn't. So I had to close that down after a couple of days because clearly, if you adopt a good idea and bring it to another area where the bicycle drivers are not don't have the same importance in society, maybe this way, then the idea might simply not work. You can comment on that, Richard. I don't mind, but I think that's also so. Not every idea works everywhere.
I think that's true, Stephan. I think there's a cultural thing. I mean, I find it if I'm in a motor car in the Netherlands, the Dutch driver is much more aware of everything that is going around, whether if I'm in Amsterdam, the tram, the car, the pedestrian and the bike. And because Cambridge being a university town, there are lots and lots of bicycles. Mm-hmm. And we're just not attuned to giving way to a bicycle. Yeah, we've had some magic roundabouts where cars go around a different way, and that we're much better at that. But yeah, it was closed in 2 days because we're just not culturally aware of it.
Yeah. Thank you. Goed. Do we have some results?
Yeah, I see here, let's say a comment, successful projects have a clear end date and decisive user input. So that's a comment. I see KISS. Let me check. Let's say there's one innovation, because let's say that's the discussion, and I heard some of these discussions. The Crystal House was built by standard elements. Innovation, should you or shouldn't you? Let's say the Concorde was innovative. Well, let's say with all the failures. mixed. Holistic view. Which is the outcome. Yeah.
All right.
Yeah, that's basically it. That's basically it. And just a comment from, let's say, the roundabout. I was on holiday in France, and I think France gets European subsidy for roundabouts because every traffic light has been replaced. And what you then see is that the main traffic line, then you need to be challenged to enter the roundabout because, let's say, you're not able to get in because of you're in a side skirt. So supporting Richard, it's not only the UK who has problems with roundabout.
Well,
over to you.
Next time we go on a holiday, go to the United Kingdom, Ruud, and see you have a roundabout within a roundabout. I mean, they advance that as well. But what are our learning points? Last slide, by the way.
Yeah.
So I think, if we share these, Stephan, I think, a lot of us sort of work on projects and we wonder why we're doing it. I do think there is a responsibility, if you're the project manager, to really challenge, why are we doing this? And if it isn't for a real purpose, you either need to gain that input or discontinue. And in my view, if you stay with it, it's not going to be successful and that's not going to be good for your career. So I do think we need to stand up and force the issue to have a good user, good vision, and to get their input.
And then there is the executive management support. And we had these two examples, Berlin and Rotterdam. Yeah, don't let them interfere or manage the interference to a zero. So good examples here, but definitely you have to have that management support.
And then, of course, you'll never get the requirements spot on at the outset. You've got to be willing to continue to rework the requirements, review the requirements, because at the end of the day, you have to deliver the right thing. And if you think about it, what was the point of delivering something like, say, Concorde at the time, which was a commercial disaster when the world had moved on around? So it's always necessary to reconsider.
And update planning constantly. There's a difference between plan and planning. And we don't know this, we know this before even all the agile methods came up. But the point here about planning is there shouldn't be any hidden surprises. So planning has to be a very honest thing.
And it goes without saying, communicate. If you don't have a team that's working together and sharing everything, again, no hidden surprises, share the good, the bad news, and make sure everybody knows exactly what it is they're doing, then you've got more chance of success.
And lastly, create a vision that goes even beyond the project. We saw this in Apollo, all the benefits. We saw this in lots of other projects. I mean, in London Olympics, they could finally fix the overground and make that a transport system in London, which was just lying there for many decades. Interesting here, outcome beats output. Outcome is the important topic here. And just coming back to the purpose, which you mentioned earlier, I think it's all about people and purpose. And it starts with the purpose people develop for themselves. Bring that into organization, that then has an impact on the society and then on prosperity and profitability or whatever you want to call it.
Yeah, and I think there's a phrase I've started to hear a lot lately, and that is people-centric projects. So I was on a call today with someone about people-centric public-private partnership projects. Are you what you're delivering for the people and for value and benefit to the people over the longer term? That might well be a topic that BPUG Netherlands might have a seminar on at some time. How to get people at the heart of the project, whatever it is you're delivering.
Yeah. All right, dankjewel. Thanks for your attention and sorry for exceeding the time.
Not a problem. I think it's 6 minutes over 6. So let's say it's been a pleasure having you on this webinar and some interesting stories about these projects. I'm not sure if there are any questions at the moment, but if people have some questions, we're available to answer them. So put them in the chat if you have a question for Stephan or Richard. Let's say the people gave some comments about takeaways. I will register them and send them out. Like we'll send out the slide deck to them, let's say with all the information. And I think, let's say this is, yeah, let's say a great story about learning from projects. I think that is what the BPUG is all about, learning from people, learning from projects and understanding what are these things which you think, oh, they're so obvious. Why did we forget? And why didn't we take them on?
Right.
So from us, many thanks for the story and the support. Slides will be sent over, otherwise I'll see some chats coming in. The slides will be sent out. There is an evaluation for the people. Let's say this session is being supported by Gert-Jan, my colleague at the other side of the Netherlands. He will put in the evaluation link where you can sign off and tell something about what you liked about this session, what you want to hear more about, and if there are any questions which you want to have asked to Richard and Stephan, send them in as well, because there's a good contact. We'll be in contact afterwards. Let's say we have a session on the 17th of September. I'll move a little to Dutch because the audience for the rest is Dutch. 17 september hebben we weer een sessie. Die gaat over die klantreis, de customer journey en hoe je die kunt visualiseren. Ik hoop dat jullie daarbij zijn. En yeah, from us, from Richard, from Stephan and I, many thanks for your time. And enjoy the rest of your evening, I guess.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.
Tot ziens.